Adelaide, the tranquil capital of South Australia, had long enjoyed a reputation as one of the most livable cities in the country. With clean air, low crime rates, and a strong sense of community, it was a place where people felt safe, where children rode bikes through quiet suburbs and neighbors trusted one another. But beneath the surface, something sinister had begun to stir. Starting in the late 1970s, a string of disappearances and gruesome murders shook the foundations of this serene city. The victims were young males, aged between 14 and 25, who vanished without a trace. Their families were left desperate for answers, and when the bodies were finally discovered, they revealed signs of horrific abuse, sexual assault, torture, and, in some cases, inexplicable surgical procedures that pointed to someone, or some group, with both medical knowledge and a chilling disregard for human life. The media soon dubbed the spree the family murders, not only due to the interlinked nature of the crimes, but because of the unsettling theory that a group, a so-called family operating in secret, was responsible. A hidden society that hunted in the shadows of a peaceful city, hiding in plain sight. They were young men whose lives were abruptly cut short, victims of an invisible menace still largely unanswered for. Their identities and stories are more than entries in police records. They are lasting reminders of a darkness that once shrouded Adelaide. These are the 5 officially recognized victims of the family murders, each one a tragedy, each one a ghost still haunting a city that never got closure. 1. Alan Arthur Barnes, age 16, missing June 1979. Alan was shy and well-liked, a typical teenager from a suburban Adelaide family. He disappeared on his way to visit a friend. A week later, his body was discovered near the South Para Reservoir. Investigators determined that he had been drugged with strong sedatives, abused, and discarded. 2. Neil Frederick Muir, age 25, missing August 1979. Neil had struggled with personal issues but was reportedly turning his life around. His mutilated remains were found stuffed in a plastic drum floating on the Port River. The precision of the dismemberment led police to suspect that the killer possessed medical or anatomical knowledge. 3. Peter Stogneff, age 14, missing 1981. Peter vanished while on his way to visit his grandmother. His scorched skeletal remains were found in the suburbs. Because of the condition of the body, the cause of death couldn't be determined, but striking similarities to previous victims linked him to the family murder series. 4. Mark Andrew Langley, age 18, missing February 1982. Mark disappeared after a night out with friends. His body was found in bushland on the outskirts of Adelaide. A surgical incision along his abdomen, with a portion of his small intestine removed, suggested the killer had medical training. 5. Richard Dallas Kelvin, age 15, missing June 1983. The son of a prominent radio host, Richard went missing while walking home. After 5 weeks, his body was found, showing signs of long-term captivity, sedation with multiple drugs, and repeated assault. This case led to the arrest and conviction of Bevan Spencer von Einem. The 1983 murder of Richard Kelvin marked the most crucial turning point in the entire family murders investigation. Unlike earlier victims, Richard's body was recovered in a state that retained substantial forensic evidence, offering police their first real chance at identifying the killer. Richard vanished one June afternoon while walking home from a tutoring session. He was the son of Rob Kelvin, a well-known Adelaide broadcaster, and his disappearance generated widespread public attention. Over a month later, his body was discovered in a remote area approximately 40 kilometers from the city. An autopsy revealed that Richard had been held captive for weeks. He had been repeatedly sedated and showed signs of both physical and psychological restraint. Most striking was the cocktail of drugs found in his bloodstream, including Mandrax, Noctec, and a rare barbiturate, substances not commonly available and usually restricted to medical prescriptions. This detail narrowed the list of suspects to those with access to such pharmaceuticals. One name stood out, Bevan Spencer von Einem, a solitary hospital clerk with no known family, who often frequented areas linked to previous disappearances. Several witness reports and a vehicle description matching his car brought the investigation to his doorstep. During a police search of his home, authorities found bottles of the same sedatives found in Richard's body. More disturbingly, they uncovered detailed written notes, pages filled with observations of young men, descriptions of habits, routines, and bizarre anatomical comments, things only someone with direct and intimate contact could have known. Von Einem was arrested in November 1983. At his trial in 1984, prosecutors presented forensic evidence, testimony from surviving witnesses, and chilling accounts from individuals who had escaped his suspicious advances. One witness recounted being invited into von Einam's car and offered a drink, which he refused, likely saving his life. The verdict: life imprisonment for the murder of Richard Kelvin. Yet the case was far from closed. During police interviews, von Einem hinted at the existence of friends, powerful men with wealth, influence, and shared interests. He never named them, but the implications were clear. He was part of something larger. That something became known as the family, an alleged secret network that may have orchestrated one of Australia's most chilling unsolved crime sprees. Although Bevan Spencer von Einem was sentenced to life in prison, the family murders case was far from resolved. Richard Kelvin's murder was only one piece of a much larger puzzle, a picture riddled with shadows, fragmented timelines, and unanswered questions. From the very beginning, detectives suspected they weren't dealing with a lone predator. The witness accounts, forensic patterns, and von Einam's cryptic comments all pointed to something far more sinister: a group of men, organized, methodical, and perhaps shielded by power. 1. The family, a mysterious name. The term "the family" didn't originate with the police. It came from von Einem himself, muttered during an interrogation. "They won't let me talk. The family knows everything." From that moment, the media latched onto the idea of an influential group of men, a hidden circle capable of burying evidence, halting investigations, and silencing the truth. Witnesses described von Einem with older men, sometimes arriving in luxury vehicles, sometimes seen together at secluded gatherings. These accounts were always vague, never conclusive, but enough to raise alarm. 2. Unnamed suspects. During the 1980s and 1990s, police quietly investigated at least 3 additional suspects believed to be connected to von Einem. Yet none were charged. One was a respected surgeon with access to sedatives and anatomical knowledge. Another, a well-known lawyer with deep community ties. Their names never appeared in official court records, but were whispered in back channels, police memos, and documents sealed under governmental secrecy. 3. Why was no one else arrested? The most haunting question in the family murders isn't just who did it, but why was only one man convicted? Multiple theories emerged. Evidence may have been destroyed or deliberately hidden. One or more group members may have had ties to law enforcement. Or perhaps the group's coordination was simply too precise, always one step ahead of the police. Whatever the truth may be, the case remains open. The names Alan, Neil, Peter, Mark still sit in unsolved files. Their families still wait, still hope, still have no answers. Adelaide, once hailed as Australia's most peaceful city, was forced to confront a chilling truth: that evil can hide behind civility, and justice doesn't always keep pace with the shadows. Nearly 4 decades have passed since the last known family murders case. Bevan Spencer von Einem remains in prison, serving life. He has never confessed, never named accomplices. In rare press encounters, he remains composed, cryptic, sometimes defiant, as if holding a secret no one can access. For the victims' families, Alan, Neil, Peter, Mark, the pain extends beyond loss. It's the silence, the decades without closure. Some parents passed away never knowing who took their sons. Others remain, sending letters, launching petitions, calling for reopened investigations, often met with silence or bureaucratic formality. South Australia police have insisted in recent press conferences that the case is still open. They claim to pursue every new lead and hope for either a confession or a long-hidden clue to emerge. But public faith is waning. Some believe law enforcement was compromised. Others suspect the case was buried to protect the powerful. The family murders left a deep scar, not only for their brutality, but for the paralysis of the system meant to bring justice. The case sparked waves of public inquiries, broader questions about institutional silence, and how certain stories are erased to protect reputations. Today, the case is taught in universities as a cautionary tale of unresolved justice, a painful, enduring reminder of how far the shadows can reach. The question still echoes: if von Einem didn't act alone, where are the others? And if the truth remains buried, can we still call it justice? A quiet afternoon on Tasmania's peninsula suddenly turned into a bloody nightmare. Within just a few hours, 35 people were killed and dozens more injured. A lone gunman armed with a semi-automatic rifle etched one of the darkest chapters in modern Australian history. This was not just a massacre. It was an event that changed the way Australia viewed violence, gun ownership, and itself. This is the story of the Port Arthur Massacre, the deadliest mass shooting in Australian history. Port Arthur, located in Tasmania, Australia, is not only a popular tourist destination but also one of the country's most significant historical sites. Before becoming a site visited by thousands of tourists each year, Port Arthur served as a penal settlement for British convicts in the 19th century. Prisoners were subjected to harsh conditions and forced labor, creating a legacy of pain and tragedy. Port Arthur lies on the Tasman Peninsula, about 100 kilometers from the city of Hobart. The area, surrounded by serene beaches and dramatic cliffs, is renowned not only for its natural beauty, but also for its colonial-era architecture and penal history. In 2010, the site was officially listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, making it one of Tasmania's most visited landmarks. Before the tragedy of 1996, Port Arthur was best known for its guided tours and heritage experiences. Visitors came to learn about the dark past of the prison settlement and to enjoy the peaceful atmosphere of this remote location. But on April 2008, 1996, a horrifying event would forever change the way Port Arthur was remembered, the Port Arthur Massacre. This peaceful tourist site became the stage of a national tragedy, not just because of the sheer number of victims, but because of the brutality and complexity of the event. It was a seemingly ordinary morning when unsuspecting tourists found their lives changed forever in just a matter of hours. Martin Bryant, the man responsible for the Port Arthur Massacre, was born on May 7, 1967, in Tasmania, Australia. Raised in an unremarkable household, Bryant's troubled family life and social environment contributed to his growing detachment from society. Bryant was the only son of Maurice and Caroline Bryant. His family suffered from strained relationships, especially between his mother and father. Caroline, a strict and controlling woman, had a profound psychological influence on Martin. She was overprotective and excessively controlling, which played a part in shaping his unstable mental state. As a child, Bryant struggled socially. School was a difficult place, and he was often bullied by classmates, further deepening his sense of isolation. Over the years, he retreated into a private world filled with anger and loneliness. Although there were occasional glimmers of social and academic ability, he consistently felt like an outsider who didn't belong. With an unremarkable appearance and shy demeanor, Bryant became the target of ridicule. His lack of self-confidence worsened with age. Instead of processing his frustration through healthy channels, he began internalizing it, allowing resentment and rage to fester. His relationship with his mother offered no psychological foundation. Her controlling nature only intensified his isolation. In 1987, at the age of 20, Bryant was diagnosed with several mental health issues, including behavioral and emotional disorders. Some speculated he was on the autism spectrum or exhibited traits of antisocial personality disorder. He showed signs of emotional detachment and even violent tendencies in certain situations. His outbursts and growing anger were becoming increasingly extreme. Before the massacre, multiple red flags signaled Bryant's dangerous behavior. These warning signs were visible in both his actions and demeanor, yet no one foresaw the catastrophic crime that would follow. One notable factor was his troubled relationship with his mother. Throughout his adulthood, Caroline continued to exert rigid control over her son, blocking him from jobs he desired and restricting his personal relationships. This created a deep sense of suffocation and emotional distress, leaving him unable to grow into an independent adult. Despite evident psychological issues, Bryant did not receive proper intervention from mental health professionals. Many have since argued that the combination of social isolation, maternal control, and untreated mental illness laid the groundwork for his eventual descent into violence. Another alarming trait was Bryant's obsession with firearms. He exhibited an unusual fascination with weapons, often engaging in unauthorized target shooting and collecting guns illegally. This fixation was a clear indicator that he was preparing for a deadly act. In the years leading up to the massacre, Bryant's behavior became increasingly dangerous. He showed a lack of empathy for others and demonstrated erratic conduct, minor acts of aggression, unpredictable mood swings, and a total disregard for consequences. On the morning of April 2008, 1996, Martin Bryant carefully planned and carried out a brutal massacre at Port Arthur, a place he had previously visited as a tourist. The events leading up to the attack revealed Bryant's meticulous preparation. Martin Bryant had legally purchased weapons and ammunition, although These actions might have raised suspicions had anyone paid closer attention. He owned a semi-automatic AR-15 rifle, a powerful weapon, commonly used in acts of terrorism or mass shootings. He also possessed a handgun, along with other equipment. One of the notable aspects of Bryant's preparation was his repeated firearms practice and research into the weapons he owned. In the months leading up to the massacre, he had devised a detailed plan, studied potential targets, and ultimately chose Port Arthur as the location for his crime. Importantly, Bryant did not have specific targets. His attack was indiscriminate and emotionless. He held no personal grudge against the victims, nor did he have any apparent motive. All of the victims were tourists enjoying the historic site of Port Arthur, unaware they were in the crosshairs of a killer. After completing his preparations, Martin Bryant began his rampage around 11 a.m. by driving to the Port Arthur historic site. The first moments of the massacre were sudden and devastating. Bryant entered the site and quietly approached tourists without drawing attention. One of the first attacks occurred near a tour bus where a group of visitors was resting. Bryant opened fire inside the bus, severely injuring many. But the tour bus incident was just the beginning. Bryant then exited and moved through the large premises, shooting anyone he encountered. Those who couldn't react in time became victims of his cruelty. Some tried to flee, but Bryant quickly chased them down and shot them. The horrifying scenes included innocent civilians, from children to the elderly, gunned down on the spot. Meanwhile, police and witnesses were caught off guard and unable to respond in time. At times, Bryant would stop and look at the victims, lying on the ground without showing any emotion or remorse. His lack of concern or empathy underscored the chilling detachment of a killer. One of the most terrifying moments occurred when Bryant entered a historical building within the site and continued his shooting spree, targeting even families with young children. These images were seared into the memories of witnesses, many of whom were staff members or tourists powerless to help. By around 12:30 p.m., Bryant had killed at least 20 people and injured dozens more. At this point, the police began arriving, but Bryant fled the scene in his vehicle. Throughout the massacre, Martin Bryant's demeanor was among the most shocking elements. Emotionless and unaffected, he carried out the atrocity without any sign of fear or regret. He showed no distress as gunfire echoed, and innocent people fell around him. Bryant had no clear motive. There were no specific targets, no apparent criteria in choosing his victims. This indicated that his actions were not driven by personal vendettas, but by blind, inexplicable rage. His behavior during the massacre revealed a disconnection from reality and an indifference to human life, traits that aligned with psychological assessments of Bryant's personality. He displayed signs of personality disorder and lacked empathy. After committing the massacre at Port Arthur, Martin Bryant didn't flee immediately. Instead, he drove to a nearby guest house, Seascape Cottage, owned by David and Sally Martin, with whom he had a long-standing dispute. Bryant had previously claimed that the couple deserved to be punished for refusing to sell the Seascape property, which the Bryant family had wanted to buy. This suggests that, although most of the massacre was random, Bryant still had personal targets in mind. After killing the Martins, who were later identified as the massacre's first victims, Bryant took a hostage and barricaded himself inside the guest house. When police discovered his location, they surrounded the building from the afternoon of April 28 until the morning of April 29. The 18-hour siege became one of the most intense standoffs in Australian police history. Police quickly sealed off the area around the cottage. Special forces, snipers, and tactical units were deployed. During the standoff, Bryant set fire to parts of the house and repeatedly fired at police, forcing authorities to act with extreme caution to avoid further casualties. At that point, the police were still unsure how many hostages were inside, and Bryant's mental state was dangerously unstable. A direct assault was too risky, so the police opted to contain the situation and use loudspeakers to urge him to surrender. Meanwhile, emergency medical teams were treating the wounded at Port Arthur and constantly updating the list of casualties. The tragedy shocked the entire nation, dominating headlines and leaving Australians in mourning. At around 8 a.m. on April 29, 1996, after a long night of Siege, Martin Bryant set fire to the Seascape guest house. The blaze quickly engulfed the wooden structure. When firefighters and police approached, they found Bryant trying to escape the flames, badly burned but still alive. He was arrested on the spot and pulled from the fire with third-degree burns, particularly on his back and legs. He was unarmed at the time and did not resist arrest. Bryant was immediately taken to Royal Hobart Hospital for treatment under tight security. Once stable, he was interrogated and taken into custody, marking the beginning of the investigation and criminal proceedings. The massacre and manhunt sent shockwaves across Australia. International media covered the Port Arthur tragedy extensively, calling it one of the worst mass shootings in modern history. Thousands of Australians laid flowers and lit candles at memorials in Hobart, Port Arthur, and other major cities. The Tasmanian and federal governments declared national mourning and vowed to re-examine the country's gun control policies. This led to pressing national questions. How was someone like Bryant, with a history of mental illness and erratic behavior, able to legally purchase firearms? Had the healthcare, education, and social systems failed to prevent the tragedy? As soon as Martin Bryant was taken to the Royal Hobart Hospital, police began an initial investigation to determine the motive, level of involvement, and behavioral patterns of the perpetrator. However, they quickly encountered a major obstacle. Bryant remained completely silent. In the first days following his arrest, Bryant refused to cooperate with investigators. When asked about his actions, motives, and the course of the attack, he either stayed silent or gave vague, incoherent answers. This forced authorities to build the case primarily on eyewitness accounts, the crime scene, and physical evidence. Despite this, the police gathered a large amount of crucial evidence. The weapons found at the scene matched the types of guns Bryant had previously purchased. Security camera footage, audio recordings, and witness testimonies confirmed he was the sole perpetrator of the shooting. Biological traces such as blood, fingerprints, and DNA matched Bryant. His car and personal belongings were found at Seascape Cottage. These pieces of evidence gradually painted a full picture, an organized act, premeditated, aimed at causing maximum harm, yet without any clear political motive. One of the most critical steps in the investigation was to determine Martin Bryant's mental state. Forensic psychologists, including Dr. Ian Sale and a team from Risdon Psychiatric Hospital, were assigned to assess Bryant's cognitive abilities and legal accountability. Some notable conclusions were Bryant had an IQ below 70, falling within the range of mild intellectual disability. However, he still understood the nature of his actions, including the ability to distinguish right from wrong and to conceal or disguise his behavior. No clear evidence of schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders was found. His behavior was consistent with antisocial personality disorder. Final conclusion: Martin Bryant was deemed fully legally responsible for his actions. This was a turning point, as being declared legally incompetent could have spared him a life sentence. Martin Bryant's trial began in September 1996. The public followed every development closely, as more than 35 charges of murder and dozens of related offenses were brought before the Supreme Court of Tasmania. Initially, Bryant pleaded not guilty, which meant the trial was expected to last for months. However, in mid-October 1996, a surprising development occurred. Martin Bryant changed his plea and admitted to all charges, including 35 counts of murder and 19 other offenses such as kidnapping, illegal possession of firearms, and causing grievous bodily harm. Many believe this guilty plea was a strategic move by his legal team to avoid a potential death sentence or harsher penalties. Nevertheless, this decision did little to sway public sympathy. During sentencing, Chief Justice William Cox delivered a statement that would be remembered in history. "I have no power to order your execution, but I can ensure that you will never be released again." Martin Bryant was sentenced to 35 life sentences, 1 for each life taken, no possibility of parole, permanent incarceration at Risdon Prison in Tasmania, a maximum security facility under strict supervision. The case triggered a legal revolution in Australia. Just weeks after the massacre, the federal government under Prime Minister John Howard passed a nationwide strict gun control law, a ban on semi-automatic rifles and automatic handguns, a national gun buyback scheme offering cash for surrendered Firearms, collecting over 650,000 guns across the country. On April 28, 1996, as news of the Port Arthur massacre spread across Australia and the world, fear and grief swept the nation. Australians, long accustomed to living in a peaceful country with low gun violence, were suddenly confronted with a horrifying truth. An ordinary citizen, unaffiliated with any terrorist group, could legally acquire high-powered weapons and kill dozens of people within hours. Media coverage was relentless, showing heartbreaking images, bodies lying on the ground, terrified, tourists, children who had lost their parents, and police struggling to contain a situation beyond imagination. In several reports, journalists were visibly emotional, unable to hold back tears as they reported from the scene. In major cities like Sydney, Melbourne, and Adelaide, thousands gathered to light candles, hold vigils, and demand change. They sought not only justice for the victims, but also concrete action to ensure this would never happen again. Immediately after the massacre, Prime Minister John Howard realized that Australia could no longer remain idle. Just 12 days after the shooting, he announced the National Firearms Agreement (NFA), a sweeping reform package with key provisions: a ban on semi-automatic weapons, including rifles like the AR-15, mandatory firearm registration, background checks, and justifiable reasons for ownership, for example, hunting or sport, a requirement for secure firearm storage at home, a comprehensive nationwide gun buyback program. The program exceeded expectations. More than 650,000 firearms were surrendered within 1 year. The government spent over $300 million in compensation, a cost considered worthwhile for the lives it helped save. Although widely supported by the public, the NFA faced significant opposition from pro-gun advocacy groups, especially in rural areas. They argued the law punished law-abiding citizens, while criminals could still obtain illegal weapons. People were losing their right to self-defense and hunting traditions. The buyback was seen as a confiscation of personal property. Still, Prime Minister Howard stood firm. In a speech in Melbourne, he declared, "If I have to wear a bulletproof vest to attend a gun law conference, I will, because human lives matter more than the right to own a gun." His words resonated deeply, shifting public opinion even among skeptics. Since the new gun laws were enacted, Australia has reported no mass shootings on the scale of Port Arthur, a more than 50% drop in gun-related deaths within 10 years, a significant decline in firearm-related suicides, especially among young people, a reduction in armed robberies and gun homicides. According to the Australian Institute of Criminology, the NFA has become a global model of successful firearm reform, studied by other Western nations, particularly the United States, where gun control remains deeply polarizing. Even though the law changed, the memory of the massacre left a lasting psychological scar on the community. Many survivors and witnesses suffered from PTSD and required years of treatment. The families of the victims continue to seek peace and share their stories to educate future generations. Port Arthur, once a popular tourist destination, has since become a memorial site. The Tasmanian government established an official memorial where the names of all 35 victims are engraved in stone next to a tranquil lake. The Port Arthur massacre did more than take 35 lives. It permanently changed Australian society. From a heartbreaking tragedy, the country found unity, accountability, and the courage to reform, transforming loss into meaningful action for a safer future. Martin John Bryant was born on May 7, 1967, in Hobart, the capital of Tasmania, Australia. From a young age, those around him described him as odd, unstable, and isolated. In school psychological reports, teachers noted, Bryant struggled to connect with peers, laughed at inappropriate times, and displayed impulsive, destructive behavior. He showed signs of cruelty to animals, a common early indicator of severe personality disorders. Although not autistic, Bryant lacked social emotional awareness, leading many to mistakenly believe he was incapable of sadness. Doctors who evaluated Bryant during his teenage years recorded an IQ of just 66, qualifying him as mildly intellectually disabled. This severely impacted his ability to learn, communicate, and distinguish right from wrong. Bryant's family was middle class, living in Newtown, a Hobart suburb. His father, Maurice Bryant, was the only one able to manage and guide him. However, as Martin grew older, tension rose between his parents, largely due to the burden of caring for a difficult child. Tragedy struck in 1993 when Martin's father was found drowned face down in a dam near their home. It was ruled a suicide, likely brought on by depression and despair over his inability to help his son. For Martin, his father's death felt like the final anchor being cut loose. From that point, his behavior grew increasingly erratic, talking to himself, laughing loudly in public, threatening others, and withdrawing from society. One unusual relationship in Martin's life was with Helen Mary Elizabeth Harvey, an eccentric middle-aged woman who inherited wealth from the Risdon Vale soft drink company. She lived alone in a mansion with dozens of cats and dogs, shunned by society due to her bizarre lifestyle. Bryant met and quickly moved in with Helen. Their relationship was unclear whether it was platonic, sexual, or one of dependency. Still, their bond as two social outcasts kept them together until Helen died in a car crash in 1992 with Bryant behind the wheel. Helen's death left Martin with over $500,000, making him suddenly wealthy, but also increasingly isolated and mentally unstable. Afterward, Bryant began stockpiling weapons, traveling erratically across Australia and Europe, often staying in luxury hotels alone, exhibiting disturbing and sometimes threatening behavior. He was questioned by police for making death threats and owning unregistered firearms. But at the time, Australia's gun laws weren't strict enough to detain him for long. Importantly, neighbors and relatives had repeatedly warned authorities about Bryant's dangerous behavior. But social services, mental health agencies, and police all overlooked or underestimated the risk he posed. Martin Bryant was not schizophrenic. He had no hallucinations, no voices in his head. He had no political, religious, or racial motivations. His actions demonstrated planning and calculation, carrying multiple firearms, choosing a busy time of day, and executing a coordinated attack. So, what drove him to kill? The final psychological assessment concluded that Bryant acted out of, deep desire for attention, a craving for control, to stand out, to shock. For someone as isolated and overlooked as Bryant, the massacre became his twisted way to ensure the world would remember his name. A sick motive, but one not uncommon among mass killers. Martin Bryant was not insane in the traditional sense. He was a product of social neglect, a failing mental health system, and a deeply isolated, angry, and unstable individual. His story is not just a warning about violence, it's a tragedy of being forgotten. A man with clear red flags, ignored until it was far too late. Among the more than 60 people present at Port Arthur that day, many survived, but none could ever live the same again. Though they escaped death by a thread, they carried lasting wounds, both physical and emotional. One survivor, Wendy Skur, a first aid officer at the historic site, recalled the moment gunshots rang out and people began to fall, one after another. Wendy was the first to rush in and help the wounded. She later said she was haunted by the screams, the gunfire, and the sight of familiar faces lying motionless. Surviving a massacre is its own form of hell. Many victims faced post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, chronic anxiety, insomnia, panic triggered by loud noises, survivor's guilt, living when loved ones did not, difficulties reintegrating into work, relationships, and daily life. In response, the Tasmanian government quickly established trauma support centers for victims and their families. But such deep wounds could not be healed with medicine or words alone. Some survivors found new paths through writing, painting, or creative expression as a form of self-therapy, public speaking to raise awareness of mental health issues, establishing charities to support other victims of gun violence. For example, one couple who survived the attack but lost their daughter founded the Rebecca Foundation, which provides school-based psychological support and scholarships for children. One of the most chilling accounts came from Peter Crosswell, who hid behind a bush with his family for 30 minutes during the shooting. I heard his footsteps, very close. I told my kids not to breathe. I saw his shoes, less than 2 meters away from me. Years later, Crosswell said, sleep remained a nightly battle. The shoes, the breathing, the gunshots, forever etched into his mind. Some survivors chose to turned pain into social action. They became gun reform advocates, demanding stricter firearm control, volunteers, supporting trauma victims, inspirational speakers, especially in violence prevention education. Their stories offered hope not just to Australians, but to the world. A reminder that even in deep suffering, people can find purpose and strength. Today, visitors to Port Arthur come not only for its convict-era ruins, but also to pay respects at the memorial site, where a simple stone bears the names of the 35 victims. A wall of silence stands nearby. No plaque, no decoration, just space to remember. For many survivors, returning to the site became a healing ritual, a way to face, not avoid, the past. Some visit every year, laying flowers. Others returned only after decades, but all brought with them deep respect and heavy memories. Before 1996, Port Arthur was known as one of Tasmania's top historic tourist attractions, symbolizing Australia's colonial penal history. But after April 28 that year, Port Arthur came to mean something else entirely, a symbol of national tragedy and awakening. The massacre was not only the deadliest mass shooting in modern Australian history, it was a turning point in how the nation viewed safety, gun control, and mental health. One of the most profound legacies of the tragedy was the creation of the National Firearms Agreement, NFA. Remarkably, it wasn't just the content of the law that stood out, but the speed and unity with which it was passed. Within just 2 weeks, all Australian states and territories, regardless of political differences, agreed to implement the NFA. Nearly 90% of Australians supported stricter gun control. Over 650,000 firearms were surrendered and destroyed in a voluntary but highly successful buyback program. Compared to the political deadlock in many other nations, particularly the United States, Australia's swift and united response became a global example of effective post-crisis policymaking. Port Arthur posed a painful question: must it always take a tragedy to bring about change? Before 1996, many warning signs about Martin Bryant had been ignored or downplayed. A well-documented psychiatric history, threatening behavior, and unusual access to weapons. Relatives and neighbors had repeatedly raised concerns, but a weak mental health system and legal loopholes meant no effective intervention occurred. In the aftermath, Australia invested heavily in community-based mental health services, stricter gun licensing procedures, including mandatory psychological evaluations, data sharing between police, health services, and social welfare agencies to detect early warning signs. The legacy of Port Arthur remains a stark reminder. Prevention must start before tragedy strikes, not after. Since 1996, Australia has not experienced another mass shooting for nearly 2 decades. Many nations have studied Australia's NFA model, including Canada, which introduced additional psychological checks and firearm registration reforms, New Zealand, which revised its laws after the 2019 Christchurch mosque shootings, openly crediting Australia's influence, the United Kingdom, which tightened handgun laws after the Dunblane massacre, which occurred just 1 month before Port Arthur. However, countries with deeply rooted gun cultures, like the United States, have struggled to find similar consensus. Many global experts consider Port Arthur a successful social experiment, proving that strict gun control can reduce homicide and suicide rates. One thing is undeniable: Port Arthur left a scar on the Australian psyche, but that very memory, that collective reckoning, became the force that drove the nation to act. Today, next to the official memorial stands a quiet space known as the Reflection, cool, with calm waters, lush greenery, and a simple stone bearing the words, "Let peace be." Their memorial, not just a tribute to the dead, but a solemn reminder to the living. We have a duty to never let this happen again. The Port Arthur massacre was not only Australia's darkest day, it was a warning to the world about the devastating consequences of gun violence, the abandonment of mentally vulnerable individuals, and the extraordinary power of political unity in the face of crisis. Perhaps the greatest legacy Port Arthur left behind isn't found in the bloodshed, but in what Australia chose to do next. 2 court-appointed psychological experts evaluated Martin Bryant. Dr. Paul Mullen, Australia's leading forensic psychiatrist, concluded that Bryant did not suffer from schizophrenia and was fully mentally competent. He described Bryant as having borderline personality disorder and mild intellectual disability, but fully aware of his actions and their consequences. Bryant experienced no hallucinations or delusions. On the contrary, he was acutely aware of the attention he was receiving. His lack of effort to conceal his actions and his absence of guilt led experts to conclude Martin Bryant is not insane. He is the embodiment of coldness, indifference, and depravity, nurtured by isolation. Bryant was represented by lawyer John Avery, who later described the defense as one of the heaviest moral burdens of my career. Initially, Bryant planned to plead not guilty, which sparked public outrage. But after overwhelming evidence and Bryant's ongoing displays of inappropriate laughter and emotional detachment, Avery convinced him to plead guilty to avoid a lengthy public trial that would further traumatize victims' families. On 22 November 1996, Martin Bryant formally pleaded guilty to all 72 charges, including 35 counts of murder, 23 counts of attempted murder, kidnapping, unlawful possession of firearms, and committing acts of civil terrorism. Justice William Cox delivered the sentence. No parole, no leniency, no escape. Martin Bryant was sentenced to 35 life terms without parole, plus an additional 1,652 years, the harshest sentence in modern Australian judicial history. The court ordered that Bryant be denied parole forever, not eligible for sentence reduction, banned from media contact, and placed in indefinite solitary confinement. He is currently incarcerated at Wisdom Prison Complex in Tasmania in the highest security isolation unit, according to prison sources. He is kept completely isolated from other inmates to prevent assault or murder. He has shown suicidal tendencies and is under 24/7 surveillance. Over the years, he has remained emotionally detached and childlike, sometimes drawing or playing music as if unaware of the gravity of his crimes. One guard remarked, Martin Bryant lives like a man-sized child in a body en masse. He feels no remorse and understands nothing of others' pain. The trial of Martin Bryant ended with a severe sentence, but for many, justice could never erase the pain of loss. However, through this sentence, the Australian legal system sent a powerful message. Violence will not be tolerated, evil will have no way out, and the innocent will always be remembered. The historic site of Port Arthur, once a colonial prison and later the scene of the massacre, has now become a symbol of reconciliation between past and present. After the mourning period and temporary closure, the Tasmanian government decided, this site shall not be remembered solely as a place of tragedy, but as one of learning, remembrance, and healing. The Port Arthur Memorial Garden was built with the full support of victims' families and the wider community. The garden is quiet and serene, with a reflective pool and stone benches engraved with the victims' names. A limestone memory wall bears the names of the 35 who were lost, but not that of the perpetrator. A discreet exhibition recounts the events, avoiding sensationalism or graphic imagery. The Port Arthur tragedy is not just an Australian story, but a global symbol of how a community can transform grief into collective strength. Instead of hatred, many victims' families chose forgiveness, not to forget but to move forward. Examples include Walter Mikak, who lost his wife and 2 daughters in the massacre, founded the Alana and Madeline Foundation, an organization protecting children from violence. Many families chose to plant trees of remembrance, write memoirs, or share their stories through films and public speaking. The government has strongly supported education by including Port Arthur in the modern history curriculum as a lesson in responsibility, compassion, and the capacity to heal after tragedy. Today, Port Arthur welcomes hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, but many come not just to sightsee, but to pay tribute to loved ones, reclaim a personal chapter of memory, seek peace in a sacred space of stillness. A tour guide once said, "No one leaves this place without falling silent for a moment." Port Arthur doesn't speak much, but you'll feel everything. The Port Arthur massacre may have concluded in court, but its impact continues to resonate. Years later, as mass shootings occurred in the United States, New Zealand, Germany, and beyond, Port Arthur was still cited as a prime example of policy reform in the aftermath of tragedy, a successful model for gun control, that still respects individual freedom, a reminder of the danger of ignoring warning signs of violence. Death cannot be undone. Pain cannot be erased. But what can be done, and was done in Port Arthur, is to turn memory into compassionate action. The people of Tasmania, of Australia, and of the world have learned community safety must never be taken for granted. We can face our pain without letting it consume us. The greatest losses can sometimes lead to the greatest positive change. Do you believe that just 30 minutes of turning your back could bring your whole life crashing down? A 3-year-old girl, peacefully sleeping in a holiday apartment with her family. Outside, her parents were having dinner, just a few dozen steps away. No sounds, no screams, no one saw anything. And then, she vanished, without a trace. The police found no culprit. No camera recorded anything. No witness saw a stranger. Nearly 2 decades later, the name Madeleine McCann remains a haunting mystery, not just in the UK, but across the world. This wasn't just a disappearance, it was a labyrinth of rumors, mistakes, theories, and lies. Today, we revisit the case that forever changed how the world thinks about a child's safety, even in the very room that's supposed to be the safest place of all. The McCanns were an ordinary middle-class British family. They weren't rich, they weren't famous, but they had everything people wish for: a peaceful little home, stable jobs, and 3 beautiful children. Jerry McCann, the father, was a cardiologist. He dealt with life and death every day, but never imagined tragedy would find him. Kate, the mother, was a general practitioner. Both were intelligent, educated, and deeply devoted to their family. Their eldest daughter, Madeleine Beth McCann, was born on May 12, 2003. She had striking blue eyes, golden hair, and a gentle smile that made everyone love her. But what made Madeleine truly unique was a rare identifying feature: a black fleck in her right eye, like a tiny lightning bolt in the pupil, an extremely rare mark. In late April 2007, the McCanns decided on a short holiday to Portugal, a land of golden sun, blue seas, and child-friendly resorts. They traveled with 7 friends, mostly fellow medical professionals, and their young children. In total, 9 adults and 8 kids. Their destination was Praia da Luz, a small resort town in the Algarve. They chose the Ocean Club, a seaside villa complex known for being clean, quiet, and secure, popular with British families. The McCanns stayed in apartment 5A on the ground floor. It was just a few dozen meters from the pool and directly behind the tapas restaurant where the adults dined each night. In the early days of the holiday, everything went smoothly. In the mornings, the group took their children to the beach. In the afternoons, the kids were cared for in the resort's play area while the adults relaxed. At night, the parents ate dinner at the tapas restaurant, taking turns to check on their sleeping children. They called it a rotating check-in system, a way to balance relaxation and parental duty. They believed the children were safe. The apartment door was left unlocked, yes, because they thought it was a safe resort. Praia da Luz was known as Britain's retirement village in Portugal, but in that illusion of safety, the unthinkable happened. One small lapse sparked a question the world would ask for decades. Where did Madeleine McCann go? The moment of disappearance and the search. On the night of May 3, 2007, the weather was calm. Gentle waves lapped the shore. Tourist families began gathering for dinner. As usual, the McCann group dined at the tapas restaurant, just 55 meters from their apartment, though without a direct line of sight to the door. Jerry and Kate put their 3 children to bed around 7:30 p.m. Madeleine was wearing pink pajamas with a white cat print. The twins, Sean and Amelie, were lying next to her in separate beds. Everything was peaceful. Jerry locked the back patio door with the interior latch, but the main door was left unlocked. They wanted to be able to go in and out easily during checks. 9:05 p.m., Jerry was the first to return to check on the children. Everything seemed normal. Madeleine was asleep, and the twins weren't stirring. He gently closed the door and returned to the restaurant. 9:30 p.m., Matt Oldfield, a friend from the group, volunteered to do the next check. He didn't turn on the lights. He just stood at the doorway and listened. Hearing the steady breathing of the children, he returned and said, "Everything's fine." But the truth is, he never actually saw Madeleine. 10 p.m., it was Kate's turn. She stood in front of the bedroom door and felt something was off. The door wasn't slightly ajar like usual, it was wide open. Wind was blowing in from the window, making the curtains flutter. She stepped inside, and a chill ran down her spine. Madeline's bed was empty. Kate ran outside, screaming at the top of her lungs. "They've taken her, they've taken Madeline." Jerry and the rest of the group rushed back. The entire resort was thrown into chaos. Hotel staff, tourists, and neighbors all joined the search. They checked every bush, every empty room, every corridor. One woman ran to the beach. Another climbed up toward the nearby forest. Everyone clung to a single hope, that Madeline was just hiding somewhere, playing a game. But time passed, and nothing was found. In the midst of the panic, a detail emerged later. One of the McCann's friends reported seeing a man between 9:15 and 9:30 p.m. walking quickly down the road near the apartments. He was carrying a small girl, dressed in light-colored pajamas. The child was limp, her head resting on his shoulder, appearing unconscious. But at the time, no one thought anything of it. No one realized. It might have been the last time anyone saw Madeleine McCann alive. 11 p.m., Portuguese police were called. But delays, confusion, and a lack of professionalism during the initial response would become irreversible mistakes. The scene was compromised. No one secured the apartment. Dozens of people had entered, touched belongings, even helped make the bed. If the abductor had left behind any evidence, it was now gone. And from that moment on, the disappearance of a 3-year-old girl in Portugal officially became one of the most famous unsolved cases of the modern world. The initial investigation and the rising suspicion. That very night, local police arrived at the scene. But instead of launching a thorough and professional investigation, they encountered what the British press would later call one of the most amateurish responses in the history of Portuguese policing. The crime scene was never secured. No forensic team was immediately dispatched to collect evidence. There was no review of surveillance footage because no cameras had ever been installed at the main walkways around the resort. A witness claimed to have seen a suspicious man carrying a little girl, but the police didn't issue a wider alert that night. They assumed Madeline might have wandered off on her own. The golden first hour was lost. The next day, dozens of police officers were deployed. Sniffer dogs were brought in. Following the scent, one of the dogs led officers to a door. But it wasn't an exit. It led back into apartment 5A, the place where Madeline had supposedly disappeared. Less than a week later, the press began to raise a question. Was something not quite right? In the parents' own account, why was the window in the bedroom open? Why wasn't the main door locked, even though anyone could enter the resort freely? Why did the group of friends, dubbed the Top of Seven, give conflicting and overlapping accounts of their checks? A theory began to spread. Not from the internet, but from the Portuguese police themselves. Madeline had died inside the apartment, and her parents had covered it up. In July 2007, 2 specially trained sniffer dogs were flown in from the UK, one trained to detect blood, the other to detect human remains. Shockingly, they responded to the curtain, behind the sofa, and even a pair of Kate McCann's trousers. The trunk of a rental car used by the McCanns, a vehicle they didn't hire until 23 days after Madeline disappeared. DNA testing in the UK confirmed the presence of blood traces in the car, but the sample was too degraded to conclusively identify it as Madeline's. In September 2007, Portuguese police officially declared Jerry and Kate McCann as suspects, accusing them of accidental death, followed by disposal of the body. The world was stunned. How could a respectable couple of doctors, devoted parents who appeared to love their daughter, be involved in her death? But just as the Portuguese media turned suspicious, the British media took the opposite stance. They rallied behind the McCanns, criticizing the Portuguese police as incompetent and lacking evidence. Major outlets like the Daily Mail, The Sun, and the BBC reported the story from the angle that the McCanns were victims. Meanwhile, internet users began dissecting every detail. Kate's odd calmness in press conferences, Jerry's expressions during interviews. They asked, why no tears? Why do they sound so scripted? Are they hiding something? Yet amidst all the suspicions, one fact remained unchanged. No body, no witness, no conclusive physical evidence. Madeline was still missing, and the last people known to have seen her alive were still her own parents. A case lost in suspicion, and a German suspect emerges after 13 years. After years of intense investigation, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann seemed destined to fade into obscurity. However, in 2020, a shocking development brought the world's attention back to the case. A new suspect emerged, Christian Bruckner, a German man with a criminal history that included child sexual abuse and other offenses. Bruckner had lived near the Praia da Luz resort at the time Madeleine went missing, and notably, he had previously been detained by German police on suspicions related to crimes against children. During the investigation, German authorities discovered that Bruckner may have been near the resort on the night of Madeleine's disappearance. However, due to international borders and slow interagency cooperation, he was not identified as a suspect earlier. More notably, investigators found Bruckner's DNA at the scene of another child-related case in Portugal. Despite this indirect evidence, there was still no definitive proof linking Bruckner directly to Madeleine's disappearance. Global media exploded with the news of the new suspect. Public debates reignited, and many held on to hope that the case might finally be solved. Yet others remained skeptical about the reliability of the evidence, fearing the case might once again dissolve into a maze of mystery and controversy. The McCann family continued to speak publicly, expressing their willingness to cooperate with police while firmly denying all baseless accusations against them. And the central question remained unanswered. Where is Madeleine McCann, the gentle little girl with the soft blue eyes? And will the truth ever be found? After more than a decade of waiting, other theories in the case. 1. Abduction for human trafficking. One of the most widely discussed theories among experts and international media is that Madeleine was kidnapped by a human trafficking ring. Praia da Luz, located in the Algarve region, is a well-known tourist area and has long been rumored to be active with trafficking networks. However, after years of investigation, police have not found any concrete evidence showing that Madeleine was taken out of Portugal for trafficking. The absence of leads, sightings, or any trace makes this theory compelling but ultimately unsubstantiated. 2. Madeleine wandered off on her own. Some believe that Madeleine might have left the apartment on her own and gotten lost somewhere around the resort or its surroundings. This was one of the initial theories proposed by Portuguese police. However, given that she was only 3 years old, it is highly unlikely that she could have gone far without being noticed in a busy holiday resort. Moreover, no belongings or physical traces of her were ever found in nearby areas. 3. Death by accident inside the apartment. A controversial theory suggests that Madeleine may have died in an accidental incident inside the apartment, and that her parents tried to hide the truth to avoid legal consequences. Unusual behavior by the parents during press conferences and the detection of blood traces by sniffer dogs have fueled this theory. However, police have never found a body or forensic evidence to support or confirm this possibility. 4. Abduction by a lone offender or stranger. It's possible that Madeleine was abducted by a stranger with no connection to the family or their friends, potentially a lone offender with criminal tendencies toward children. Christian Bruckner is often cited as a prime example of such a suspect. Still, proving a direct link between any suspect and Madeleine has been incredibly difficult, leaving this theory filled with unanswered questions. 5. Staged disappearance or conspiracy. Some of the more extreme theories suggest that the disappearance might have been staged, potentially as part of a more complex conspiracy involving organized crime or the concealment of a secret. These theories are usually based on the lack of transparency during the early investigation, inconsistencies in testimonies, and peculiar behaviors by key figures. However, such theories are generally unsupported by verifiable evidence and are largely regarded as speculation. The Madeleine McCann case still holds many unanswered questions. Each theory has its own strengths and weaknesses, and none has been conclusively proven. The one thing that is certain is this: the whole world is still waiting for the truth, hoping that one day Madeleine will be found or that the case will finally be solved. 17 years have passed. Madeleine McCann, the 3-year-old girl who disappeared one quiet night in Portugal, has never returned. No farewell, no trace. No one knows what really happened behind the door of apartment 5A that night. Perhaps she was kidnapped. Perhaps she got lost. Or maybe the truth lies somewhere very close, but we missed it. The Madeleine McCann case is not just an unsolved mystery. It is a painful lesson about investigative mistakes, the power of the media, and above all, the endless pain of parents. Whatever the truth may be, Madeleine deserves to be known, and the truth deserves to be revealed. If this story leaves you unsettled, there are many other heartbreaking and chilling cases waiting for you to explore. Here at File X, we will continue to tell real mysteries with respect, neutrality, and sharp insight. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any cases. And if you have a case you want us to cover, leave it in the comments. Maybe you will be the one to unlock the key to the next case. See you in the next episode, where another case is about to be opened. And you are the companion on the journey to find the truth. Sydney, a modern, orderly, and peaceful city among the safest in Australia. But on a March morning in 1989, a dead body was found beneath the trees in a quiet park. It was an elderly woman, her face bruised, a ligature mark around her neck, and the strangest detail, a pair of women's underwear neatly placed beside the corpse. From that moment, police entered a nightmarish labyrinth where the next victim could be anyone's grandmother, mother, or neighbor. And the killer? He hid among the crowd, smiling, speaking politely. Before striking, he was called the Granny Killer. But when the truth emerged, the whole of Australia shuddered. This was not just a murderer. He became a symbol of the darkness that walks among us. Born in 1932 in Wolverhampton, England, Glover immigrated to Australia in 1956. He lived in Mosman, Sydney, with his wife and 2 daughters. Glover was known as a polite man, a hard worker who actively volunteered in the community, especially helping the elderly. However, behind that kind exterior lay a criminal past full of theft and assaults against women. He looked so proper, polite, soft-spoken. I remember him bending down to pick up the bag I dropped. I thanked him, then turned away. And then everything went black. In her final moments, as his hands tightened around her neck like an invisible noose, the man's eyes were no longer kind. They were cold, emotionless, as if she were just an old doll to be thrown away. Detective Mick Gerondis stood frozen beside the 4th body, yet another elderly woman, living alone, showing no signs of struggle. No witnesses, no clear evidence. But what was bizarre, why was there always underwear? He leaves it behind like a signature, like he's playing cat and mouse with us. And I'm starting to fear that if we don't act fast, another mother, another grandmother will never make it home. They think I'm a good man, a model neighbor. I go to nursing homes with cakes, help the elderly. They smile at me, trust me. But I know, my kindness is just a mask. I don't regret it. Each time I ended a life, I felt relieved, like a monster inside me was finally quiet. I didn't choose them, they chose me. Every wrinkled face, every lonely smile. It was like they called out to me, and I just finished what they were ready to let go of. Glover typically targeted elderly women who lived alone. He approached them kindly, then attacked them with a hammer and strangled them using the victim's underwear. After the murders, he often stole their wallets and meticulously arranged the crime scene, placing shoes neatly and pulling up their skirts. This initially led police to suspect a sexual motive. Gwendolyn Mitchell-Hill, 82 years old, attacked on March 1, 1989, in a nursing home. She suffered head injuries and broken ribs. Her wallet was missing. Winifred Ashton, 84, attacked on May 9, 1989, near her home. She was struck in the head and strangled with underwear. Her wallet was also missing. Margaret Pahood, 85, attacked on November 2, 1989, on her way home. She was hit in the head and robbed of her wallet. Muriel Falconer, 93, attacked on November 23, 1989, at home. She was struck in the head and strangled with underwear. Her wallet was missing. Joan Sinclair, 60, attacked on March 19, 1990, at home. She was hit in the head and strangled with underwear. Her wallet was missing. Case details. At noon on March 1, 1989, in a suburb of Mosman, NSW, where most residents were elderly widows, 2 young men exited an elevator in a nursing home and found 82-year-old Gwendolyn Mitchell-Hill crawling toward the security door with a head injury. The men immediately called for an ambulance. At first, it was believed the elderly woman had fallen. But upon examining the wounds, doctors concluded she hadn't just fallen. Her head injuries and broken ribs were caused by external force. Gwendolyn died soon after. Her wallet was missing, and police confirmed it was a robbery murder. However, no evidence or witnesses were found other than the 2 young men. Police realized they were dealing with a cunning criminal. More than 2 months later, on May 9, 1989, a passerby discovered the body of 84-year-old Winifred Ashton in front of her house. She lay face down, her shoes and cane placed nearby. Like Gwendolyn, her handbag was gone. The autopsy revealed bruises on her head and shoulder caused by a blunt object. 5 ribs on her left side were broken. But unlike Gwendolyn, the cause of death was asphyxiation. Police began to suspect the killer was targeting elderly women in the same area, murdering them in a similar fashion at the entrance to their homes, all involving missing wallets. The case was even sent to the FBI for assistance. On October 18, 1989, another elderly woman was attacked, but miraculously survived. However, due to Alzheimer's, her vague description of the attacker was of little help. Public anxiety surged again when 3 more elderly women were found dead within 24 hours, all strangled with underwear. New South Wales' most experienced detectives were mobilized. Then, on January 11, 1990, a major break came. The killer made a crucial mistake. That day, a man wearing a pastry delivery uniform entered a room in Greenwich Hospital with 4 frail elderly women. He approached one, Daisy, a terminal cancer patient, and groped her. Daisy, panicking, pressed the alarm, and a nurse rushed in. The man fled, but the nurse noted his car's license plate and reported it to police. Hospital staff recognized him, a regular visitor selling cakes. His name, John Glover. Police called Glover in for questioning about the January 13 assault. But his wife soon reported that he had attempted suicide and was hospitalized. On January 18th, police visited him in the hospital and requested a photo to show to the nurse and Daisy, who both identified him as the assailant. Detectives now believed Glover could be tied to the series of murders. He denied involvement, and police pretended to accept his story, but secretly assigned 6 detectives to follow him. In the following days, they saw him frequently chatting kindly with elderly women. On March 19th, Glover visited the home of Joan Sinclair at 10 a.m. The two had a close friendship, and the police made the mistake of letting their guard down. Hours passed with no movement in the house. Concerned, the detectives decided to break in. Inside, they saw a blood stain on the floor and a hammer lying in drying blood on the carpet. Joan's body was found in the back, strangled with underwear. Glover was immediately arrested. Friends and family were in disbelief. The quiet, family-oriented man turned out to be the notorious underwear killer. Police investigations revealed Glover was addicted to gambling. To feed his habit, he stole from vulnerable elderly women who were easy prey. The crimes were not sexually motivated, but he deliberately staged the scenes to mislead police. Psychologists suggested his choice of elderly women may have stemmed from childhood trauma. He had lived with a harsh, domineering grandmother, which may have planted the seeds of hatred. Glover's trial began in November 1991. He pleaded not guilty to murder by reason of insanity. The court rejected this defense and sentenced him to life imprisonment without parole. On September 9, 2005, after over 10 years in prison, Glover hanged himself, closing one of Australia's most disturbing and horrific criminal cases. The case shocked and terrified the public, especially the elderly. It also raised serious concerns about how society protects the vulnerable and the efficiency of investigative systems. Glover's case showed the importance of processing information effectively during investigations. It emphasized the need for better training and skills among law enforcement to handle complex crimes. I did it because I had to. Something inside me wouldn't let me be. Every time I killed, it went quiet for a while. Glover admitted to killing 6 women, but psychologists believe the real number could be higher. He was intelligent, calculated, and above all, a master pretender. When the lights go out, Sydney seems safe once more. But the ghost of the granny killer, the murderer behind the mask of kindness, remains a chilling reminder. Evil doesn't always growl. Sometimes it whispers, smiles, and holds the door open for you. The case of Ivan Milat, the most infamous serial killer in Australian history, remains one of the most shocking criminal cases the country has ever witnessed. Between 1989 and 1992, Milat abducted and murdered at least 7 backpackers, most of whom were foreigners, in the Belanglo State Forest in New South Wales. The case not only horrified the nation due to its brutality, but also because of the long, complex investigation and many unanswered questions. In the late 1980s, Australia was enjoying a period of peace following an economic downturn. Backpacking had become a popular trend among young people, not just Australians but also international travelers. They traveled by bus, train, and especially by hitchhiking, a cheap, friendly, and adventurous method. The Hume Highway, which connects the 2 major cities of Sydney and Melbourne, became a central artery for this form of travel. But few realized it was also the perfect hunting ground for a serial killer hiding behind a seemingly ordinary face, Ivan Milat. The first missing persons report, James Gibson and Deborah Everest. Date of disappearance, December 30th, 1989. Departure point, Frankston, Victoria. Destination, Albury, NSW, about 600 kilometers away. Description: two close friends, both 19, carrying backpacks and dressed for summer. James Gibson and Deborah Everest, both from suburban Melbourne, decided to embark on a youthful adventure. They told their families they planned to hitchhike north to attend a music festival and camp for a few days. When no one heard from them after the first day, concern grew. However, in those days, a few days of no contact during backpacking wasn't considered unusual. What made the disappearance strange was that 2 weeks later, James's backpack and camera were found hundreds of kilometers north in Galston Gorge near Sydney. No one could explain why his belongings were there, while the two travelers had vanished without a trace. Simone Schmidl, the German girl with an Australian dream. Date of disappearance: January 1991. Nationality: German. Age: 20. Intended route: Melbourne to Sydney. Simone had come to Australia on a long vacation to experience the free-spirited lifestyle. Being careful and responsible, she regularly wrote letters and sent postcards to her parents in Regensburg. The last letter detailed her plan to hitchhike to Sydney. But Simone never arrived. She vanished during the Australian summer. Her family contacted the police and embassies, but there were no leads, no witnesses, and no clues. Police took note of the case, but, like with James and Deborah, did not immediately suspect foul play. The German couple, Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschied. Date of disappearance: late 1991. Ages: 21 and 20. Nationality: German. Background: a couple traveling around Australia before returning to Europe. Anja, a medical student, and Gabor, a former soldier, had chosen Australia as their final travel destination before settling down back home. After arriving in Sydney by bus, they planned to hitchhike to Melbourne, a route similar to Simone's. When their families didn't hear from them over Christmas, something entirely out of character, they contacted the police. But again, there were no bodies, no suspects, and no evidence. Their disappearance became another unsolved mystery and a strange blind spot in the investigation. The British friends, Joanne Walters and Caroline Clark. Date of disappearance: April 1992. Nationality: British. Ages: 22 and 21. Last seen King's Cross, Sydney, a vibrant district known among backpackers. Caroline and Joanne met in Australia and worked short-term jobs to fund their travels. They told friends they were planning to hitchhike around New South Wales. 3 weeks later, when no one had heard from them, their roommate contacted the police. Yet again, there were no signs of harm. They had simply gone missing. A pattern begins to form, but no one connects the dots yet. Individually, each disappearance seemed understandable at the time. Travelers changing plans, losing contact, misplacing belongings. But seen together, the similarities were striking. All victims were young, healthy, and traveling solo or in pairs. They were hitchhiking, vulnerable, and untraceable. They vanished along the Sydney-Melbourne route. Families described them as responsible and trustworthy. However, in 1992, police departments across states still worked in isolation. There was no national database for missing persons and no system to prioritize temporary disappearances. Thus, the serial killer quietly continued to hunt in the heart of peaceful Australia. September 19, 1992, a grisly discovery. On an ordinary Saturday, Stephen Urquhart and Bruce Pryor went camping in Belanglo State Forest, a dense, expansive area about 140 kilometers south of Sydney, known to locals for hunting and weekend barbecues. While venturing deep into the woods, Bruce noticed something odd among the dead leaves, a rounded object sticking out of the ground, covered in twigs. He brushed the dirt away and recoiled in horror. It was part of a human skull. They rushed back to their vehicle and called the police. The remains were soon identified as Joanne Walters and Caroline Clark. Joanne had been stabbed 14 times, mostly in the back and chest, indicating an attack from behind or while fleeing. One stab punctured her lung, and 2 severed her spine, possibly paralyzing her before death. Caroline had been shot 10 times in the head with a semi-automatic Ruger rifle at close range. Evidence suggested she was blindfolded and executed. The shell casings were scattered in an arc, indicating the killer circled her while firing, calm and deliberate. October 5, 1993, more bodies found. Almost a year later, a man gathering firewood found another shallow grave, James Gibson. Nearby lay Deborah Everest. Unlike the British victims, they were killed with knives. James had 8 stab wounds, 1 pierced his heart. Deborah suffered multiple skull lacerations, likely inflicted post-mortem. Strangely, James's backpack and camera had been found 100 kilometers north years earlier. Was it a decoy? A psychological breadcrumb left by the killer? November 1st, 1993, the final three. Three more bodies were found in a separate part of the forest. They were Simone Schmidl, Gabor Neugebauer, and Anya Habschied. Simone had multiple stab wounds, some through her back, like Joanne. But Gabor and Anya suffered the worst. Gabor had been shot 6 times in the head and chest. Anya had been decapitated. Her head was never found. Beheading, especially of a woman, indicated deep-seated rage or severe psychological disturbance. The killer hadn't just murdered, he had attempted to erase identity and humanity. Task Force Air, the hunt begins. A special task force of over 30 top detectives was formed, led by Inspector Clive Small. The mission: find the monster responsible for brutally murdering 7 young people. They used criminal profiling, a new approach in Australia at the time, to build a suspect profile. A local within 100 kilometers of Belanglo, familiar with the terrain, owned a Ruger 10-22 rifle, the murder weapon. Likely had a Ford WD or pickup truck, suitable for transporting victims in remote areas. Displayed signs of sexual deviance and extreme control, seen in the tying, blindfolding, and decapitation. Possibly a hunter, military conscript, or mechanic, skilled with weapons and knives. Using this profile, investigators identified over 230 potential suspects based on gun ownership, criminal history, hunting licenses, and vehicle registrations. But they needed a breakthrough. A survivor speaks. Paul Onions' lucky escape. In early 1994, British man Paul Onions called the task force. He said a man had tried to abduct him while hitchhiking near Belanglo in 1990, and he'd barely escaped. Paul recalled being picked up by a man named Bill, around 40, Australian accent, driving a Ford WD. Bill acted polite but strange, mentioning camping and touching Paul's belongings. When Paul asked to stop, Bill pulled a gun and rope. Paul jumped out and fled, and was rescued by a passing couple. He had reported it to local police, but the case was not pursued. Now Paul described Bill, and police matched him to Ivan Milat, already on their suspect list. Milat owned a Ruger rifle, lived near Belanglo, drove a Ford WD, and worked in road construction. Most chillingly, he had a violent past, including a prior kidnapping case against a girlfriend, but was acquitted. May 22, 1994, the arrest. Over 50 armed officers raided Milat's home in Eagle Vale, southwest Sydney. He was arrested immediately. A search of the house revealed a Ruger 10-22 rifle, matching the murder weapon. Ammunition identical to shell casings found at the crime scenes. Victims' backpacks, sleeping bags, tents, and personal items. Cameras, jackets, and shoes with traces of victim DNA. Restraints, duct tape, and maps of Belanglo. Each item was a silent scream from the victims, evidence of Milat's horrifying spree. The man behind the mask. Born in 1944, Ivan Milat was the 5th of 14 children in a Croatian-Australian family. Raised in Sydney's suburbs, he dropped out of school and worked manual labor jobs. Behind a calm exterior, he had a violent, controlling nature. Abusive to girlfriends and aggressive with friends, yet always managed to avoid jail due to lack of evidence. Neighbors described him as quiet, reserved, a lover of guns and camping. No one suspected the quiet man next door was a calculating killer who had evaded capture for years. 1996, justice served. In 1996, Ivan Milat was convicted of 7 counts of murder. He received 7 life sentences without parole. He never confessed, never explained his crimes, and never showed remorse. In prison, he remained silent, as if the murders were a game he had already won. Milat died of cancer in 2019, taking with him the secrets of other possible victims. Authorities believe the true number may exceed 7. Today, signs at Belanglo Forest read, "Do not go alone, do not go at night." Locals still claim to hear footsteps and wind that sounds like crying at night. And they still whisper the name Ivan Milat, the backpacker killer, as a warning. Because in the deep forests of Australia, there are paths you should walk only once. Otherwise, you may never return.